But hear, O earth, behold, I will bring evil upon this people, even the fruit of their thoughts. The fruit of their thoughts, because they have not hearkened unto my words nor to my law, but rejected it. You listening? I've quoted from Jeremiah 6:16 through 19. A year ago, I warned the people nationwide that if the church fails, Sacks will take over. There is every evident sign that today in the so-called church, I'm not talking about the church. A lot of people mistake the real church from the so-called church. And just because somebody gives themselves a title church doesn't mean that it's a church. A church is a body of called out ones. So the Lord has a genuine church, a biblical scriptural church. But the devil has a bunch of people that call themselves a church that is not the biblical scriptural church. But a multitude of church-going people say, well, I belong to the church. They don't belong to the church. They belong to the devil. They're not living clean and godly and holy. They have found themselves new paths. My Bible says God's children are still walking in the old paths, and they're listening to the sound of the trumpet. I'm coming, sister. There is every evident sign in the so-called church that the devil is taking over and has got the fastest growing religion in the nation. And there is every evident sign that the so-called church has lost its influence in the world and no longer has power to influence people. And according to reports across the nation and worldwide, the so-called church, and I don't want to be identified with the so-called church. I want to stay with the old-fashioned group that's staying in the old paths, that has the blessing and the touch and the anointing of God, and I never want to be called away. I never want to obey that call of the devil to come down or to find new paths. Because everyone that's deserted the old paths have found that their lives, their ministry is no longer fruitful, no longer powerful, no longer anointed, and no longer signs, wonders, and miracles follow their ministry. And only as we stick to God's old paths will God walk with us, because God refuses to walk in the new modern path of modern ideas and non-modern methods. The recent Gallup poll and the survey, 58% of all church people surveyed absolutely confess that the church so-called in the world today no longer has any power to influence people toward the right. So the church, because it's gone into a new path, has no power to influence people or draw people in. So they're using new methods to attract people into the church. They say attract people to Jesus. Because the old Bible standards and the old Bible methods and God's ways are not sufficient. Are you listening? Listen to this. Religion, I'm just reading a few headlines and a few titles to newspaper articles or articles from current magazines and national and international. I haven't got time to read all this. It would take me 10 days. But listen to this. Religion was in during the 40s and 50s, but it's lost its steam in the 60s. In other words, the church is no longer having a fire. no longer any water, so they've lost their steam. There was a revival in the 40s and 50s, but now the church is dead. Listen to this. Church is dead, the priests declare. From the U.S. News and World Report, why churches are losing clergymen. Preachers by the thousand are deserting the church and the ministry. Some of the larger denominations specifically mentioned here is the Baptists, the United Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Catholics. Are you listening? For one example, the United Methodist Church is asking local congregations to contribute more money to train new ministers because there are only 33,000 clergymen available for 42,000 congregations. Altogether, statistics released by the National Association of Pastoral Renewal in September show the rate of priests' departure from the active ministry so far this year is up 31% over 1967. 31% more ministers are leaving the ministry. And 70% less people now are training for the ministry than in the past. So when you can't get ministers to train for the ministry, you can't get new ones. 70% less ministers in training to be preachers. More than 30% are leaving the ministry. That's around 100%. So if we can't get preachers to train for the ministry, 70% less say, I'm not interested in being a preacher. And 30% of those that are preachers now are leaving the ministry to sell automobiles and insurance. That's a flat 100% less preachers in a very short while. Why? They're not interested in a cold, dead, dry religion that won't even support them financially. Most of the ministers declare they don't get enough money to live on for one reason. They can make more money doing anything else. And the majority of them leaving because they're so bound and so in bondage by denominational bondage, man-made rules and regulations, that they're not free to be the minister that God's called them to be, and they're leaving the ministry. Listen, should the Pope retire? The Pope blasts rebel priests. Why? Because the Catholic priests are leaving the Catholic Church by the thousand, declaring they'll no longer be a priest. And never has there been a time when the Pope is so upset. Are you listening? Don't call me Father, a Catholic priest. Pope Paul defends infallible dogma. You listening? 57% feel that religion has lost its influence. Fallen priests. Pope says the church is in a period of self-demolition. It's demolishing itself. Of course, he's talking about the Catholic Church because he's lost so many priests. And the Catholic nuns are leaving the nunneries by the thousand. There's never been a time when so many priests and so many nuns are denouncing the Catholic religion and saying the Pope don't know what he's talking about.